Okay, everybody. I've started the recording. I've started the live transcript. Okay, it's not a bad, good enough image. Okay, and just get rid of this. Okay, so this is my pre-taped body, the body in literature and film, B74, which I'll be putting up shortly. It happens to be Tuesday, and we'll be meeting tonight at 6:30 p.m. I believe 6:30 to 8, although trust what's on the, I have so many dates flying around. I think that's right. So we also have a new prompt, which I'll mention, I'll refer to here, and we can also bring it up tonight. And on the table, so to speak, we have Dora, the case of Dora still, The Three Faces of Eve, the movie 13, directed by Catherine Hardwicke, which is I suppose, the new entry in our viewing and reading. But of course, I'm keeping all of these in the air, so to speak. And so I'll be talking about 13 in relation to Eve and Dora, and your prompt encourages you to think about that too. So I wanted to start, I'll show you this card. And this really covers Eve, Three Faces of Eve and Dora in a kind of master discourse that we're used to seeing, where there is a master, either Freud, Dr. Freud, or Dr. Luther, so it's very clear. With Freud, of course, there is no traction. Dora has no traction in there because Freud is the sole author of the case study, and her voice does appear in there, and often tellingly she seems to be saying more than Freud is willing to countenance. And so the way this works, in a way, let's just take Freud for the moment, is you've got Freud as the master over here as kind of an S1. He's addressing Dora as an S2. Now, the father brought Dora, so there's another master kind of out here somewhere. And really, Dora is failing to emerge into a cultural legibility that supports and sustains a particular framing of reality by the master discourse of her father. So Dora's father brings her to another master, another father figure, at least, in the form of Freud. And initially, I think Dora is wondering if this father figure can help compensate her for the distortions being imposed on her experiential reality by her own father. And to a degree that happens, and at least to the degree that Freud more or less, he does accept that Herké, kissed her and grabbed her, and which has been discounted. It's too inconvenient. The family won't acknowledge that, and they relegate that to Dora's overactive imagination. Freud does not. That must have been something like a relief to Dora. And typically we see this so often, that relief is quickly met by a new cookie cutter attempt to reformulate how she culturally emerges, because he says, yes, all that happened. What's made you sick is that you didn't like it. You did actually, you just don't know it. You won't let yourself know that you know it. So you made yourself sick rather than acknowledge that you responded to Herké grabbing you. And so what Freud calls hysteria is also family dysfunction. But he tries to isolate it in Dora, and even goes so far as to say, I'm sure that if your father gave up the mistress, your symptoms would probably resolve, but I hope your father doesn't, because then you'll learn that getting sick is a way to get what you want. That seems pretty wrong-headed by Freud. And we can see Dora trying to extricate herself ultimately from both her father and, of course, her father figure. So there's something very brave, I think, very pioneering about Dora that I think we can appreciate with both Eve and then with Tracy Freeland, played by Evan Rachel Hunter, and and Evie Zamora, her 13-year-old friend, who in fact co-wrote the screenplay of 13 with Catherine Hardwicke. And there's some real history behind that in it. Catherine Hardwicke dated Evie Zamora's the father. No, I don't have her actress name here right now. And then they broke up, but she continued to be interested in the daughter, whose friends then got arrested for selling crystal meth, which caused Hardwicke to come in and say, what is going on? And the outpouring that followed eventually wrote the screenplay of 13. So it's very raw, it's very visceral, and you have both. You have a 13-year-old girl and a 30-year-old woman, 13-year-old girl co-writing, 30-year-old woman directing. So this is an important movie in a way, because you finally have a relatively unmediated voice of the girl and of the woman talking back. I mean, Dora talks back, but Freud decides how to edit that. Eve talks back, or rather Eve Black is Eve White talking back. But Dr. Luther keeps bending the discourse of Eve Black, and in order to animate Eve White enough so that she can become Jane. And in the process, both Eve White and Eve Black have a scene where they allow that they're going to disappear. So Jane emerges. So we really have a detailed process of that Eve White has this so-called split personality, and in order for the cure for her, and one thinks of Plath in this regard, is to accept her the cultural legibility that's going to be stamped on you. But this might remind us of Barbara Kruger's graphic, that in all these cases, the women are being, in a sense, turned to stone by the clinical gaze, by the gaze of the master discourse. And so there's something very sad to me, and kind of about that last shot in Three Faces of Eve, which is meant to be, oh damn it, I just knocked over my cards. It's meant to be uplifting. She's, but who is she? She's in a way has been turned to stone, and she sits. In fact, there's no sound. I think you can even see her lips move at one point, but doesn't matter. She no longer has a voice, but she has a cultural legibility. She has assumed her space, her position. And then Plath details a process like that with the applicant. I come out of the closet, sweetie, take this hand. And Plath, of course, who's also the voice speaking back, details how much the imposition of cultural legibility on the body of the woman is dictated by the unacknowledged crises of the man. And we're going to be moving on to the male body in subsequent weeks here to point that out, which I think is part of why Kruger in Your Body as a Battleground has the negative image of the woman, and then has the photographically correct image of the woman, implying that what we see as the image of the woman is the negative of the requirements of the man. This is most obvious in issues of gender performance. So but I want to detail this a little bit more too. That notice that the way this box works is the master gets to call out the slave, or the S1 gets to call out the S2, and the S2 becomes nothing more or less than what the S1 declares them to be. So what happens to everything that doesn't fit? Well, it sort of drops down into product, what I'm calling product. And we see that particularly clearly in Dora, that all the excess of Dora, all her protests, all her refusals, all her contradictions, Freud uses them down here under product to send them back to himself as proof of his theory. So no matter what Dora does, like either she conforms to Freud's voice and that confirms him, or she refuses and that drops down to product, which he uses to support his theory. This is probably most obvious when he says, Dora said no, which means yes. So that's the power of the master gaze, is they get to convert your excess. They get to convert what contradicts the outlines of the cultural legibility they are imposing on you. They get to repurpose the excess. And so in that way, they don't have to, your excess can't contradict the theory because it gets plowed back into proof of the theory. So theory and reality become inextricably bound, but it's Freud's reality that needs to be stabilized. And you see this with Dr. Luther, who runs out of the room every time Eve Black appears, because Eve Black is an extreme excess that Luther can't handle. I mean, arguably, there's a bit of an Eve Black move when Dora brings her purse into the room, and he sees her putting a finger in and out of it, and he says, "You realize that's women's genitalia?" And she says, "I knew you would say that." And I love, that's one of my favorite lines from Dora, because who's playing who? Or as the Aretha Franklin song puts it, who's zooming who here? Isn't she playing him too? Like, everything's female genitalia to you. So I'm just going to play act this, and on a more serious level, I think she's trying to suss out his limitations, and this is one of them. Like, I can't do anything that you won't send back to me as a further confirmation of your own theories. So Dora, have gone as far as I can, and today's our last day. And then Freud will spend 5 years literally writing and rewriting this case study, adding almost a third of the length of Dora's footnotes he added in the 5 years after the analysis is over, because her leaving breaches his line. It breaches the theory reality line, and which means it allows the real to come pouring in. And the real is the undifferentiated experiential reality that precedes the symbolic, it precedes language, it precedes theory, which is a part of all of our bodies. All of our bodies have to emerge from the illegibility of the pre-symbolic and take some kind of status. You cannot be legible if you don't enter the symbolic order, and you cannot enter the symbolic order without some aspects of you not being symbolized. So the question is, and it's a question of this class, is how do you feel about the ratio of the part of your body that became culturally legible through the symbolic and the parts of your body that don't participate in that legibility? Who's in control of that? And this is the key. If somebody else dictates the parameters of the symbolic order that allowed your body to emerge as legible, then that means the things in you that were not allowed to cross over that mediation are cut away, and that can make you sick in a sense. So the more you are in charge of what's legible and what isn't, with the caveat that it's to be symbolically legible, it can never be the equivalent of the pre-symbolic illegible. That's why the real is always more than anybody's reality, than anyone's reality. The battlefield here, the war, does the gaze turn you to stone? If you are the product of the gaze of somebody else, you're going to feel like you can't move, and that you can't breathe. And to some degree, Tracy feels that all of a sudden even when she's 13, when she's still wearing, I think one of the mean girls cuttingly says, what did you come out of some cabbage patch, with her? And she runs home and throws out her socks, and we see that transition. We need to be careful, I think, not to idealize. She's not necessarily wrong in throwing out the socks, in the sense that she's like, oh, I've been, who am I? I don't know who this is now. It made sense. I didn't have to think about it much when I was a girl. Now I seem to be sexualized being, and there's these other sexualized being, boys and other girls. My best friends at the moment aren't sexualized. The two friends she pretty much dumps after that. So and this is Alice in Wonderland. I mean, she basically goes through the looking glass and tries to reassemble herself on the other side. But what she doesn't, and Dora does something similar, and so does Eve. What's the power of the master gaze is to cut and to reassemble is so ferocious that you can go through the looking glass and assume that you're going to be able to reassemble. But the gazes, the gazes of parents and authority figures and institutions and clinicians and even in pharmaceuticals and all of these things, then the battle is in full swing. So to some degree, she jumps from one box to another, from a desexualized girl, which again makes it easier for other people to keep their realities organized, to the hypersexualized 13-year-old. And there's an Eve. I mean, it's funny that Evie Zamora is the sexualized teenager, and Eve Black, Eve White. I suspect it may well have been a conscious decision in the naming there. But the problem with Eve Black, we already discussed a little bit, is that because she's pure and angry sexualization, she still doesn't have a sense of her own boundaries. Clearly, Eve Black puts herself in harm's way every night by going to these roadhouses. We see the guy who plies her with 8 drinks and then expects to have this way with her back in the hotel room, and it's only her collapsing on the bar where he's, that soldier. He's not a main figure in the movie, but it's something very chilling about that, because even when she's dancing provocatively for him, he's chewing gum and he's got this hard look, like, this will do. This is what I bought. This is what I paid for. And then he's finally like, that's enough, let's go. Time to pay. And then she collapses, and clearly he feels victimized. And he's like, what the hell is this? And then just walks off, doesn't help her at all. And that particular scene suggests why it's so painful, and why women in this case, but we'll be talking about men, might choose to stay within the scope, and I use that word deliberately, of cultural legibility, even when it's hurting them, even when this man is essentially date raping or just flat out raping. It's not, I mean, if they were alone in a hotel room at this point, I think a rape is quite possible, of self-justified rape on his part. You realize how many drinks I bought you. This is time to pay me back. And why would anybody, woman or anyone else, stay inside a cultural legibility like that? Because becoming culturally illegible is painful. I mean, that's what Tracy Freeman realizes, is that in my 7th grade, going on to 8th grade, because I'm dressed like 5th grade, more or less, I'm illegible to increasingly to the peers who are valued in this. How do I become visible to Evie first and foremost, frankly, because the boys in 13 are remarkably unimportant in a different way. It's neither Tracy nor Evie is shown having any kind of romance or hand-holding, or the boys are props to establish their relative value on the sexual marketplace of competing with other women, and Evie isn't above even trumping. I hardly use that word anymore, but making sure that she makes a play for Tracy's quote unquote, well, I don't know what to call them, boyfriends clearly don't cover it, but Tracy's allowed to try out her supposed sexual availability on a boy, and then Evie has to try it out on that same boy. It's a kind of a dog pack mentality, like, good for you. You experienced your sexuality with this kid, and I can do it after you, because I'm the alpha female in this relationship. So that kind of the competition between the two girls is really brought out very vividly. There's no real equivalent in the other 2 movies of a close girl / woman friend. Dora, of course, had Herké's wife, and that helped to a point, until the wife made it clear that she was more interested in maintaining the status quo, which put Dora in a particular spot, than shoring up Dora's attempt to have a new emerging legibility. So in every case, what we see is the barrier, the passing from girl to woman is a little like is like going through a looking glass where there's a price to pay. And what this class is about to some degree is trying to talk back to the gaze, trying to shore up the tolerance for the painfulness of being on one side or the other of cultural legibility. Because the choice shouldn't be that either you step inside the scopic regime is a phrase that Judith Butler has used. It polices your body, and the reward of that is you're culturally legible, but you also, in a sense, you're in jail, and the world becomes a panopticon. And this is where the shopping trips in 13 are, really telling, like which stores you go to, and the mother makes a kind of, to me as a parent, perhaps a kind of poignant attempt, like here's these blue jeans, because initially the mother, and this is a very unusual mother. Remember, I want to talk about this tonight, hopefully, but there's no mother in Dora. Freud just makes sure she's very distant. No, the only maternal figure we see in Three Faces of Eve is the stern mother who brings her in and says, "Kiss your grandmother goodbye. You'll feel better." And the father seems very ineffectual in that scene. He's like, "Do what your mother says." She clings to him and says, "Papa," at one point. So we can also see some of the ramifications of a weak father discourse, potentially, where the mother, in this case, is allowed to pass on her own. I mean, presumably this is the mother's mother, although I don't know if I can prove that. Maybe there's something that proves that, but it seems likely. So there's more going on with this mother. There's more going on between herself as a daughter and her dead mother, who's the grandmother. And it's too small a scene to read thoroughly into it, but to me, it's a very concise allegory of what happens when a mother who has a daughter has not fully emerged out of the scopic regime of being a daughter for their own mother. To what extent is this mother submitting her daughter to the edicts of the grandmother, who's, I mean, obviously I'm reading this allegorically at the moment, and then the father has no role to play, and that's her foundational trauma. Now, it's quite possible to make a case that this is 1957. This moment of being forced to kiss the dead grandmother seems suspiciously translatable as sexual trauma, being forced to kiss a close family relative, like or hair K, in a manner that violates your sense of yourself as a girl, and in the presence of an adult that you wish to trust. And we know that Christine Sizemore, the woman on who this movie is based, had quite a few more than 3 personalities, and sexual abuse was a part of her background, and that's conveniently translated into a regrettable but understandable outcome. So going to a little bit more of the let's see. Let me go back to your. I'm going to put myself up in the corner here so I can see your second prompt, and just walk through that a little bit, and we can talk about it more this evening. So below is a schema of the process we've been charting so far about how representations of the body, so far the female body, also by implication the figuration of the male body, can be sensed by the demands being placed on the female body. Move a biological body into a domain of cultural intelligibility. All these things do that, where we have, or are told, convinced we have, a quote body. So number one, there's gender performance. Femininity, masculinity is constructed through relations of power, which is felt by the subject, a male or female, as a constellation of normative constraints. And then this constellation provides a background that produces, but also regulates various bodily beings. Now, one of the cultural crises being navigated in 13 that is not, I don't think, in Dora or Three Faces of Eve is this movie is made in 2004, and part of what the battleground has shifted to is there has been the feminist movement of the 60s, and that did liberate in a lot of ways these assumptions that a housewife could be put in the house and medicated for anxiety and to be a reliable consumer for appliances. That particular scopic regime got shattered, broken by, among other things, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Clearly, Plath is trying to break that frame in all of her poems, but there isn't a movement quite yet at the time where Plath is writing that out of the very. So Lady Lazarus has that force, that power. Out of the ashes I rise with my red hair and eat men like air. There's a sense, I mean, that's proto 60s feminist movement. Not she necessarily wants to actually go around eating men, but eating the requirement, the kind of eating those requirements that men are imposing on women in order to remain unaware of themselves. So Lady Lazarus, who wants to, in a sense, she's like, if I'm going to rise from the dead, which really means step outside the scopic regime, because the emergence into cultural legibility is offered to the woman as her new life. And this is another reason it's hard to step outside of it. It feels like a kind of death. And culturally and in terms of the symbolic order, it is. It doesn't mean you die, but which is where the Eve White death and the Eve Black death seem much more, and seem to keep things much more tidy for the master gaze of Dr. Luther and Freud. So the constellation provides a background that produces but also regulates various bodily beings. In 2004, what's partly emerged, and this is by now Madonna has had her career, songs like Material Girl and Like a Virgin, which pick up from Marilyn Monroe's song Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend from the mid-50s, which was I may even incorporate that song into maybe our third prompt. It's worth looking at. But that woman on the marketplace capacity. So there's a lot of shopping that goes on, and then there's, really Tracy gets accepted by Evie after she steals the purse of some distracted, stressed out woman, and the money is immediately used to shop, and then like, where do you shop? We have stores like Forever 21, which sounds weirdly magical. Like I've whenever I go into Forever 21, I expect to come out younger, and it never seems to work. I don't know if all the people who work in there are 21. Actually, most of them look to be around 17. So, but the name of the store, Forever 21, is pretty redolent of a certain myth at the base of the emergence into the cultural legibility as a young woman. Is that from now on, you have to stay young. We might as well call that store Forever 21 or else. And Brooke, who is the older cousin, that is supposedly taking care of Evie. We did a kind of a fairly harrowing scene, where she literally has been cut around the ears. She's had more plastic surgery. She doesn't look that old, obviously. She has to wear push-up bras, I guess, with padding to go to her probably virtually a minimum wage job, maybe a little more, with tips. I mean, this whole concept of tips at a bar like the kind she works at, her job is really performing for tips. I mean, she has some base salary, which is not enough to live on, and that's the way a lot of bars work in this regard. That implicitly, whether you're the waitress and Playboy, the Playboy Mansion made this a point, Playboy bunnies as waitresses. You were tipping their gender performance, or a place like Hooters, which also makes it kind of explicit. And then it's like, how well can you dance back and forth across that line? You accept the flirting. How much hand grabbing do you accept? It's not quite a strip bar, strip club, the strip, but these are all on a continuum. That your body is now in the marketplace, and the idea, if you're somehow quote unquote skillful enough, you can hop back and forth across that line of flirting and availability, which then gets paid for. But we saw it with Eve at the bar in the scene I've already mentioned. This puts the woman in danger, frankly, because how do you keep track of when does a man think they've bought you versus you're paying me for my performance? You're not paying me. And those of you in my other class can see this in Pretty Woman. Leave that aside. You're paying me for my performance, and the guy's like, "No, I was paying you for your performance. I bought you 8 drinks, and now you're bought." And when did that line get crossed? Because it's not the same for both sides of the equation. But that's a good example of how cultural legibility of a woman's body, in the way that it emerges, becomes a capitalist paradigm of credit debit. When Brooke is at the bar with her enhanced, with sort of this enhanced breast enlargement, which could be either surgical, which I imagine Brooke is going to be facing, or temporary with the falsies, or whatever they're called in the movie. And then, of course, the face lift, which is really painful. And this movie is full of cutting. Freud cuts up Dora and reassembles her in a kind of Frankensteinian way. I think we've already mentioned that. Brooke is allowing herself to be cut to stay forever 21. That was a really harrowing footnote to what seems to be just a fun, bouncy idea, like let's just all stay 21. And of course, Tracy cuts herself in probably the most literal and metaphorical at the same time protest against. Tracy cuts herself because she's being cut, and it looks counterintuitive. Obviously, if you're being cut, if you're feeling cut by the male gaze, by expectations, etc., why would you contribute to that? Why would you cut yourself, quote unquote, more? But that's not what I don't think Tracy's doing. She's not trying to cut herself more. I would argue she's trying to cut through the scars and the stitchings that she increasingly feels are being placed on her. That she's trying to cut herself out of a scopic regime, not further cut herself in. And that is given the primacy in 13, which in terms of genre really does operate like a melodrama, a maternal melodrama. You have a much stronger and more legible mother figure in Holly Hunter, who got nominated for an Academy Award for her performance in the movie. She also, she's a single mom. The father is relatively successful. He's married again. He has another baby. It seems like his child payments are uneven at best. It's hard to trace that, but she's doing hair in her home, doing nails, presumably doing all this, again, all of this kind of beauty industry stuff, and barely making ends meet. She having a hard time carving out enough time to go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. She needs her meetings, and people she knows from her meetings, they show up in their crisis, and she tries to make room for them. A lot of it at the expense of her daughter. One of her AA friends comes in, and then the dog and the child is in Tracy's bed, and the dog has soiled the bed. And it's not hard to feel sorry for Tracy in those moments, but at the same time, possible to see that uh, Tracy's mom, Melanie, I think, is doing the impossible. She's trying to save everybody and is in danger of saving no one, not even herself. She insists on the fact that she's still a sexual being herself, much to her daughter's distress. And again, it cuts both ways. Tracy may have a point, like, your boyfriend had a cocaine overdose in the house last time. Now he's been to rehab, and now he's back. And how am I supposed to deal with this as the 13-year-old girl? He's in the bathroom brushing his teeth. He's roaming around. He's not my dad. You know, it's a very valid. Uh, the Melanie's boyfriend is an interesting case study because, like so many things in this movie, there's a lot of nuance there. Like, he clearly does have issues, but he's not an abuser. He doesn't actually encroach on Tracy's boundaries, except for the fact that he's there. He does pick her up from school and bring her home for the final confrontation, where Brooke and Evie, in a kind of very dysfunctional tag team effort, are going to throw Tracy under the bus. And it's when Brooke finally calls Tracy, a very vulgar term for female anatomy, that the mother says, "Get out," and Melanie says, "Get out." And shortly after that, she sees the scars of the cutting. And there's a line in Lady Lazarus, "There is a price for the eyeing of my scars. Beware, beware." Because she feels, she presents herself as sort of the woman in The Applicant, or a woman stripping on stage, or a date performing some kind of gender performance. So the discovery of the scars, and that's not the first cutting, of course. There was the belly ring and the tongue ring, tongue stud, I guess, not a ring, could be. And those aren't, again, the question there is, where's the authorship coming from? Because I would be reluctant to say belly rings are bad. Don't get a belly ring. Don't get a tongue stud. The question is why. I mean, if it feels within your own discourse as a form of your own expression, that's very different than tattoos or other things that one allows onto the body in an attempt to conform to the painful cookie cutter phenomenon. So it's hard to tell. Tracy's going so fast, and so much of it's being accelerated by Evie, and Evie's like half making out with the tattoo artist. And Tracy, there's certain points where Tracy tries to tap the brakes, like, have you gone to bed with that tattoo guy? And Evie's like, yeah, sure. And then she goes, no. But that's one of those moments where you can see Tracy switching from enjoying the lights flashing past at this accelerating pace to, like, wow, where are we going and who's driving? So bodies become bodies, which is to say they only appear, only endure, only live, and I should say only sustain themselves within the productive constraints of highly gendered regulatory schemas, which reward some performative iterations more or less than others. And this is the point. This is kind of gets to what Foucault calls biopower in a way, because once you are trying to endure and to live within the productive constraints of a highly gendered regulatory schema, then you're in a kind of panopticon, and everything that looks at you begins to feel like the master gaze. So the regulatory norms of gender performance are based on presuppositions about sexual anatomical difference, but they could translate that into a demand for a performance, for a performative modality, in order to constitute the materiality and the visibility and the legibility of the female body, and then materialize that body's performance as quote unquote gender, which then stabilizes this is the point where, to go back to this is the point. Everything I'm talking about here is freezing I don't think I can quite put them both up at the same time. Maybe, why not? So that when the master's gaze hits you, your gaze hits the side of my face. I'm inside. I'm turned to stone or plaster. If we use Plath's term, there are two of me now. This body that's culturally legible, this white unbreakable body. But the corollary of that is what she calls her old yellow self. So it conforms or fails to conform at that point to the norms by which a body becomes visible at all as something visible and markable. And it's, there's another case of this in a way that when Tracy can sort of acquiesces that Evie needs to move out, and initially Evie cuts her dead. She doesn't invite her in the latest group outing. It's obviously very, very painful for Tracy. And that scene is, it's really sad and hard to watch because, and this is true of all of 13. It reminds me of the work of Jean Rhys, A Voyage in the Dark, or Good Morning Midnight, if you've heard those from me and other classes. The ferocity with which women under the kind of paralyzing master gaze can be so unable to help one another. Evie is so fully committed to being the sort of alpha female within the cultural legibility. It's hard to know because she of course does lie about so much. Is she lying about what her uncle did to her? Given how much she's sexually acting out, probably not. We don't know. We can't tell because part of the effect of whatever abuse Evie went through is that she has no core. She has no, other than her performance, she has nothing. So she's ferocious about, and she will use everybody and everything. Certainly the boys, or even that older neighbor that Evie kind of encourages this strange attack of sorts, until the boy, who might be in his 20s, kind of freaks out. And we can just vaguely remember this used to be some older guy next door that Tracy, the girl, knew, and others. And you see hesitation on Tracy's part. So all the young women we've seen, Dora, Eve White, Eve Black, Jane, Tracy, her mother Melanie, Tracy's best BFF, Evie, all struggle to emerge into cultural eligibility. But going through that looking glass takes them out the other side, where they are, quote, free only in the sense that they can now be seen and that they can perform for a gaze. But the disciplining process by which they emerge marks them, cuts them as something else, something other than they feel they actually are. So which is why the self, quote unquote, self-cutting is a desperate attempt at self-expression within a modality that has silenced self-expression. All that's left is physical sensation, not just the pain of the cut, but also the emergence of the blood as a result of the cutting, which is also viewed as a desperate attempt to see something about your body that hasn't been mediated. There's nothing in gender performance that mediates your blood. And so to see it is to remind yourself that there is a pre-symbolic body here, that it's illegible. Blood is not legible within the modality of feminine emergence. But so it's proof. The blood in this sense is the real. There is no place for it in, quote, reality, but that's also the point, to express something literally from your body, which proves, and certainly reminds you, but also proves that you are more than the cut up and reassembled culturally legible body that has been allowed to emerge through the performative gender into a scopic regime. Okay, that was kind of intense. So I'll leave it there. This might be a tape worth rewatching. I've also walked you through the prompt a bit more, and so we will reconvene at 6:30. I'll check. I think the URL link may already be up on Crocus. If it isn't, I will put it up. Okay. thanks for listening, and see you in a bit. And I'll post this soon.